Hi everyone, welcome. We're just waiting a couple of minutes for everyone to come in. We've got a fair few coming in tonight from all over the world, so yeah. Hi everyone.
Do you think that it means that I have no audio?
No, they can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you, Stephen. Just a few logistics before we start then. If anybody has any questions as we're going on, then do put them in the chat and we'll try and answer as many or ask as many of those as we can. We will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes and then we will open the floor for live questions as well. So we'll try and get as many of your voices into this as possible. Let's have a look. I think it looks like everybody's pretty much in. Logistics before we start then. If anybody has any questions as we're going on, then do... Excellent, thank you. So if everybody can, if you're not muted, yeah, if you could please mute so we don't get any feedback. Brilliant, okay, thank you everyone for coming. We're on Embercombe live, it's Wednesday night, and we're really delighted this week to have Stephen Jenkinson with us all the way from Canada. Stephen is an author, an activist, a teacher, a farmer. He's known very much for his work with death and dying, and I'm sure a lot of you will have seen the fantastic film Grief Walker, which was about his work. He co-founded the Orphan Wisdom School and has been touring all over the world with Nights of Grief and Mystery, which I haven't had the chance to see yet, but I've heard from so many people are completely wonderful. We're a little bit sad because he was due to be here teaching with us at Embercombe in about 2 weeks' time, I think, and obviously because of our situation that hasn't been possible. So at the moment we're looking at next May for a kind of rerun of that. So next May is when we're expecting him to come, but he's been kind enough to join us tonight for a talk. So I will pass over to him in a minute, but I was just thinking as you were coming in, Stephen's colleague James today asked me why we'd invited Stephen to teach and to speak tonight, and I just said off the top of my head, it's because of his honesty, his wisdom, grief, his acceptance, his connection to the land, ancestry, to going into the darkness rather than avoiding it. And I ended that by saying, and those are the things that we believe in Embercombe and work for too. So Stephen, welcome from us here in Devon to you over there in Canada. My first question, it's an obvious one probably, and I'm sure you've been asked a million times, but I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask it again. Strange days we're in, and recently they seem to have got even stranger than normal. And I've heard of you calling this virus an extraordinary revelator, and something that you've said previously. And I just wondered if you might talk about the revelations that it's bringing to us as humanity, to you personally. What are the things that you think this is about?
Well, I'll start with the with your list of credentials that you credited me with there. It makes me sound like a fun guy, obviously. So clearly everybody's signed up for 45 minutes of stand-up comedy. So we'll see what we can do. You know, I think it's important to distinguish between revelator and the function of revealing, and any consequence that we would automatically assume would ensue from such a thing. So I've heard it said many times already that this sequence, this cascade of events that we're on the receiving end of is some kind of mass, spontaneous initiation or rite of passage. I think nothing could be further from the truth, to be honest. So I'm going to begin with a list of stuff it probably isn't. And that's the first one. it seems to me that if we used language like that blithely and easily, then we lose a couple of things. And one of them is the realization that all of these rites of passage, they're culture bound, you know, they're all their meaning, all their consequence, the purposefulness, all the intent that drives them, all the undertakings, all of the ceremonial underpinnings, all of these things are culturally derived, culturally generated and sponsored, and finally endorsed and employed culturally. And there's no indication at all that what's happening as a consequence of this virus is anything more than an ongoing sullen kind of indictment of a way of life that more or less promised the visitation of such a thing. So the first thing I'd say mournfully, which is that I was just outside the door here a few days ago, and I was listening carefully to what I couldn't hear, meaning that there was a kind of quiet that I reckon hasn't been here in probably 100 years. And the moment they blow the all clear signal, which of course it'll never be true that things are all clear, but you understand what I mean, the first casualty will be that quiet. And I find that extraordinarily lamentable, not only because I'm a fan of quiet, but because the quiet indicates that we've agreed to be defeated in our mania for proceeding at all costs. And the banishment of that quiet is a sign that we're unwilling, more or less entirely, to abide by the instruction that has come subtly with these days. I said somewhere, some recording recently, that it seems to me that this virus is a god. And so let me elaborate then. First of all, that's not to say that it's from a god or it's because of a god. It's not, in my view, any kind of punishment or retribution, no corrective surgery implied in the whole thing. Its presence alone has a divine consequence. And the first one seems to be the extraordinary inability of contemporary hip people to know what the etiquette might be of being in the presence of something divine. As subtle as that might sound, or as almost involuntarily natural as it might sound, that we would just naturally either take a knee or drop an inflection or some other sign of basic humility or basic welcoming strategy for that which we don't understand. I don't see that myself in the corner of the world that I inhabit. I see what W.H. Auden so grimly characterized us as being, that is, preferring to be defeated rather than persuaded. And one of the great lamentable consequences of what's going on, and this is going to sound awful, I just granted ahead of time, is that nowhere near the carnage that was anticipated several months ago has taken place, or it would appear is likely to take place. Nowhere near the number of deaths, probably an economic carnage that wasn't front of mind for so many people, but the kind of cost to life that was anticipated when I started hearing about it in late February, early March, hasn't come to pass. And as a consequence of that, the willingness to turn the page and to get on with things and to return to a pre-morbid way of life is, I would call it shocking if there was no precedent. I would call it shocking if there was no sign that we, at least in my little corner of the world, were inclined to that very kind of thing. But I'm not shocked about it at all. Aggrieved, though, Absolutely. I have no grievance about it, but I have enormous grief. Somebody was in touch with me the other day and said, gee, and these things you've been releasing lately, you seem a little down. Well, yeah, shit, yeah, of course, down. Very much, you know, I'm, some of you are aware that I'm not a hope guy. I don't have it. I don't cling to it. I don't employ it. I do my best to avoid using the word entirely, largely because of what I saw it do to dying people when I was in the death trade, and the utter unwillingness to inhabit the present, which hope obliges you to. So I had no hope to lose, you see. I had no hope for a better day. I had no hope that you know, the Western version of humanity was spiritually attuned to the troubles of the times, and were willing to take up the spirit work of this particular generation or two. And alas, it seems to be the case that this is another hiccup on the road to self-improvement. And it's going to be readopted, no doubt, by the self-help people as an occasion for self-improvement. When it really, what it should be, it seems to me, is an occasion for wondering about the veracity and the necessity of having a self at all.
So what should we be being in this moment then? I mean, if we can take some learning out of this, I mean, I totally agree with you that the silence that I experience in my home has been broken the last few days because our lockdown has been eased. It feels like we're at a moment for thinking, okay, you know, this has happened. What is it that we should be being in the moment, in this moment, rather than doing?
The reason I use the word revelator, it's a word, I guess, borrowed from an understanding of prophecy. And the amazing and sort of trenchant consequence of prophecy is it has absolutely nothing to teach, nothing to advocate, nothing to sell, because it understands the current regime, all its permutations, as signs to be read, not as a guidebook to tell you what to do. I mean, it seems to me at least, we're surrounded by people who are more than willing to tell you what to do because of this, because of that, instead of this, instead of that, and so on. I'm just not one of those guys. So I don't have an answer to you about what we should do. But we could investigate where all the inquiries after the shoulds comes from. And I would suggest to you, it's more of the same. That is, the mania for being re-instructed comes from the faulty or the fouled instruction that we've been following in the West for some considerable period of time now. Yeah. So if we could only learn the poverty, which is so unbecoming of how many opportunities and privileges we do have in my corner of the world, you can decide where you're sitting if it's true for you too. I mean, the possibilities before us are probably unprecedented. And the willingness to proceed accordingly might be as unprecedented as those opportunities are. So if we were willing to learn poverty, instead of lunging towards the next exit and following the Elon Musks of the world to Mars or to immortality or to a cleaner vehicle, maybe the question about what to do next wouldn't be the one that so many people lead with in their inquiry as well as their conversation. And then people wouldn't be so seduced, perhaps, to answer the question and to make as if what we should do is a knowable thing. I mean, if I could tell you a story, that's usually all I have,
Yes, please, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. And it's a true story, I should say. And it really happened too. And I'm fond of making that distinction, largely because if you are locked onto any kind of a news feed, you know quite well that there's many things that appear to be happening. It's not clear that they're true just because they're occurring. And there's a good number of true things that some of us seem to be waiting for, and they're not happening. So a useful distinction, no? But it's a true story. It's a vignette. It's not a story exactly. It's not worthy of Homer, but here it goes. I'm on tour yet again, and I think I'm outside Chicago, Illinois in the United States. And we're driving down the highway towards the city. And the traffic is slowed down. And there's construction obviously everywhere. And there's a big road sign. I'd seen this road sign, as no doubt you have, many times before. It had never struck me as oracular until then. But it's clear that we have oracular degeneration among us. And so it's easy to miss these things. The sign, black lettering on an orange background, in a way that nobody could mistake if only it were noticed, said, "Be prepared to stop." And of course, everyone went past it. And I suspect now the lettering of the sign might be changed. It might have already been changed. I don't know. I guess we'll see. The new lettering is likely to be something closer to "Be prepared to be stopped." So it's a kind of prophetic literacy I'm pleading for here in the answer to your question. Not literacy about prophecy, but rather the willingness to recognize that any prophet worthy of the name is paying extremely close attention to the way things are and has virtually nothing to say about even the near future. Because a good understanding of the future from a grammatical point of view is that it's the imperative version of the present. It's the would that it be of now. And in that sense, we're busy, or not so busy perhaps, crafting the near future that we imagine is out in front of us. But it's not out in front of us. It's a companion, not unlike our future deaths are. The near future is a companion, and it's here. And we're crafting it as we go. And the ultimate understanding of that is our responsibility to the generations not yet among us. See? And who shall we be coming from this time to them? I wonder. Will the time finally come? I suspect it will. When they're maybe 10 or 15 years old and they look us straight in the eye and they say, "When you were my age, did you know what was happening?" And what might the legitimate answer be? Not the comforting one, not the soothing one, but the authentic one might be something like this. In these times, anybody who wanted to know what was happening could know. But not everybody wanted to know, and so not everybody did. Which may explain a lot of the world that they're about to inherit from us. And the follow-up question to that is likely to be something like, "So what did you do?" And of course, whether we know it or not, we are answering that question, even as we sit here and ponder what we should do next. We're answering the question, what we did.
So for those of us that will respond to our future generations that we did know, the what did we do? Obviously, going back to the question before, which we can't answer, but what would we feel proud of? What would be the answer that we could feel proud of And I hear that you're saying to learn to live in poverty, to stop. But what would you say? How would you answer that question? What did you do?
Well, I think without being coy, I'm me agreeing to be here and talking to a lot of little squares on the screen is one answer. I don't normally do this. I don't really know how to do it. I don't know where to look. I don't know where to address myself. It's a very odd etiquette that we find ourselves engaged in here. Yeah. Okay. And I would say, again, it's an imaginative, not imagine. No, that's not the right word. It could go like this. How are we to imagine the world that would ensue from what we do and what we don't do? Is it an act of imagination? And in that sense, perhaps one step away from fantasy. I would say to you, it isn't. Instead, it operates this way. You don't have to imagine anything. All you have to do is occupy the intermediate position between two other generations, the one you asked me about and the one you're on the receiving end or the inheriting end from. You see, if you're willing to see yourself that way, then the answer to the question you've asked comes from your willingness to realize what you inherited willingly and otherwise, admirably and otherwise, consciously and otherwise, whether it made you proud to be where you are and to be from who you're from, to be willing to claim them, or have you found yourself on the outside looking in of your own inheritance, wishing that you'd come from anybody but who you come from and ended up anywhere but where you did, more than compelled by the vaguely intact spiritual traditions of other places in the world, drawn intractably towards ayahuasca and peyote and all the other beam me up Scotty strategies for people to whom this was not part of their birthright. Yeah. And that might sound a little harsh to some people, especially people who are fond of ayahuasca. I myself don't know the medicine or the drug too well, but I'm familiar with the attraction. I've certainly seen the consequences of the attraction. And when I was in the death trade, I was, of course, at some level trying to ready people to die. This is a very peculiar job when so few of them thought that they were dying in the first place. And of those few people, fewer still were willing to be helped to die. They wanted help, of course, not to die. And in that circumstance, they were obliged, usually by default, to begin to wonder what was to become of them after they died. They may not have said it overtly, but I can tell you it was very much a presence in the room, much more often than not. And they had begun to worry, or worse, that they were about to disappear without a trace. No matter their belief system going in, no matter whether they were animists or Confucians or Buddhists or whatever they might have been. And they tended towards making large gestures, writing things down, proclaiming, maybe not unlike what I seem to be doing now, and especially making these home movies where they had an opportunity to instruct people from the grave, if you will, to be played at the funeral and thereafter. And if you inquired why they were filming these things, they would generally say, so they could have a presence at the events that they wouldn't live long enough to see in their children's lives and in their loved ones' lives and so on. That answers the question, are you making a movie and for whom? But it doesn't answer the question, why? In other words, why do you need a film to be present at these events that you won't live long enough to see? And the answer inescapably was that your presence at these events relied entirely upon the living to see to it that you're there. And you've begun to realize during the long arc of your life, when it was your chance and your responsibility to see to it that the people who preceded you were at the events that you lived long enough to see. You didn't do it so very much, and it didn't occur to you as any kind of a dereliction of duty until now. Never mind some of the psychic and mythic and poetic consequences that begin to ensue from the realization that the failure to carry your ancestry has a pretty predictable consequence of you not being carried. So we have 80% of the people in Canada who've died of the COVID virus are over 65 years old. Most of them have died in old folks' homes. And people have asked me, what do you make of that? And I said, well, I think it's pretty obvious. The reason so many old people are dying in old folks' homes is because there's old folks' homes. It's because of that segregation. And we are being instructed on the consequence of segregating the population by demographics, by age group and generation and so on. And this is one of the poverties that you referred to in your question, right? So one of the immediate consequence could be, and won't be, a reintegration into the ongoing culture of the people who seem the least efficient, the least capable of keeping up, and perhaps the least willing to go along with things as they are. And it may be their very slowness that could turn into that road sign outside Chicago on the highway, that the presence of older people among us may be the plea to stop.
Yeah.
Mm.
Can you talk about other poverties?
Wow. Well, you know, the old saying is, don't get me started, because it's not a short list.
Yes.
But I'll offer one to you. I'm called to task frequently for intimidating people with the language that I attempt to find and to craft. Well, one can't be responsible for the intimidation of other people, not really, not unless you're directly threatening them. But if you exercise something that's been granted to you, you're responsible for the exercise, and only secondarily for the consequences and the willingness of people to consider it, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, then, I would say to you, when I was in the death trade in the early days, one of the things I heard routinely was the invocation of a language to describe the dying, to talk about the feelings about dying and so on, that was so estranged from the realities of dying that they couldn't be found in the talking. They couldn't be found. You could say that the language that dying people were using, and their paid professional caregivers and their families, that language saw to it that the realities that people were inadvertently hankering after, the realities of dying, that they become lucid and available, were the first casualty of the kind of talk that was employed. In other words, all the talk of reassurance, of hope, of being positive, all of these things are a clear, they're standing clear opposition to the realities of dying. So one of the classic poverties of a culture that prides itself on a general education and literacy is oftentimes a kind of psychic or emotional or philosophical literacy tends not to follow suit. Yeah, and it's, I mean, I think people understand what I'm saying with this, lamentably so, that in the marketplace of ideas, the willingness to honor the language that we're entrusted with in order to approach things honorably and hesitantly and humbly and so on, the absence of that stuff tends to turn a lot of the talking head scenarios into, you know, howls of expertise right? Relentless, unblinking expertise. And no doubt some people hearing me say that say, well, like you mean? Well, I'm advocating ambivalence here. I don't know how you can be an expert in that. I'm advocating a kind of breakdown of certainty. I don't know how that weeps expertise of the kind that I was just deriding a moment ago. And, you know, I was lucky enough to work with, to perform with an old Black man who was a storyteller years ago. And he was many things, but for me, he was a thief. And what he did was stole from me for the rest of my life any opportunity I might have had from my callow youth to drag myself through my days, complaining bitterly that I'd never seen the real thing. You see, he stole that from me. And the consequence was I have an obligation that comes directly from those days to proceed as if I was in that man's presence. He wasn't an expert, he was a master. There's a difference. He was a master principally of tragedy. And I was lucky enough to sweep up after him from time to time. And anything you hear from me that seems compelling is probably the leavings that fell off the table of the banquet that he set every time he appeared.
The real thing. Just hearing you talk about being in the death trade, Stephen, and your descriptions of some of the processes there, I wonder, you know, are we collectively in that process ourselves?
Sorry, the process of what?
The dying process. I mean, we're looking at kind of a moment for humanity. Are we heading, or some of the things that kind of come to consciousness then for the dying, are these the things that we're kind of facing now?
It's not clear to me that we're facing any. Well, there's a couple of things with your question. First of all, I'm really loath to talk about we, right?
Okay.
There's a lot of people with a lot of different scenarios going on in a lot of different countries, and you know, settings like this seduce us to generalize across all our differences. And so let me not do that. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, it's not clear to me at all, although I've been sitting at this farm for more weeks than I know how to count, looking out the window. And so I'm not, I mean, don't listen to me. I'm not current about anything. And if you value currency, then I would go do something else.
I think there's current and there's current, though. It depends what you're listening to, doesn't it? So yes, yeah. A deeper current.
Maybe so. And from where I sit, I could tell you this from my experience with dying people. You would think that the information, the clear diagnostic information, clearly rendered by a responsible and able physician, that somebody was dying, would be enough to help them turn the corner and begin to understand themselves in those terms. I can tell you, if that's how it went, there would have been no work for me to do. You see, my job security was a direct consequence of the fact that people can be sitting in the presence of their own death and utterly proceed otherwise, blithely, easily, troubledly proceed otherwise. And they did. Routinely, they did. So, and that's with death in the room. What we have now is the possibility of a kind of pandemic which is less and less likely to play itself out as a pandemic. Do I think that that will invariably achieve what the personal diagnosis of mortality cannot achieve? I don't think so. So another little story maybe to elaborate the idea, because it must sound insane what I just said. If you haven't been there, that must sound crazy. I mean, how could people be told that they're going to die, that they're dying, and not begin to understand themselves in those terms? Well, consider this. I'm old enough to remember a time in North America when everybody knew there was enough oil for everyone forever. How could you tell that we knew it? Oh, that's easy. If you observed our buying habits and our general behavior, every time we had a key in our hand and put it in an ignition, for example, you would be persuaded that we did indeed know that there was enough oil. I didn't say there was enough oil. I didn't say it was true. I just said that we knew it. And the mark of our knowing was in how we carried ourselves. So if you take out the word oil and you put in the word death or die in the characterization, you ask the following question. Would everybody listening right now agree that they know that they're going to die? Most people would probably say yes. And the next question would be, but how do you know that you're going to die? What are the signs? How has this instructed you, led you, intimidated you, bullied you, or has it? I've done any of those things. And the chances are very good, at least if you're a card-carrying North American, that the likelihood is that there's very little sign in your ordinary days. That's the important distinction here. Not in the peak moments like this, but the ordinary days, there's very little sign that you know that you're going to die. You may fear, you may suspect, you may vaguely tolerate, but if we're going to use the verb to know, it's not clear to me that the people that I am in contact with on the road and through emails and the performances that you mentioned and all of that know it. And you wish otherwise for them. I do, because without that, you're going to understand and believe there's such a thing as sudden death. And I'm pleading with people to begin to recognize that there's no such thing as sudden death. Sudden is a confession. It means you didn't see it coming. It means you had no way of knowing. But that's not true. You had every way of knowing that you would die. And the principal instructors in that are everyone in your life who died before you. That was your chance to get a PhD in the way it is. That was your chance to get it right. And when you use the word sudden death, you're confessing to truancy of a particularly debilitating kind, you see. So I'm not prescribing a moral order here, but in response to your question, this is a lament that you're getting back. Because if we really did proceed in the presence of our legitimate mortality, not our premature departure from the scene because of a virus, but our legitimate mortality is likely to humble us, it seems to me, and do something about our excesses, it seems to me. That's my guess. And the absence of one seems to have the consequence of the absence of the other.
I've got a good question here from Simon Cohen, just on the chat here, and it's a personal question, but he's asking how you're preparing for your own death.
Okay, let's be really clear about what prepare means. Since I'm answering the question, I'm not putting words in his mouth, but if I were to ask that, this is what I would mean. It doesn't seem to me that preparation is the same thing as insurance. For example, prepare means, to my mind, try to get good at it. Not ready myself in the sense of risk management or things of that kind. So if that's what readiness is, it has to be that, because everything else is a refusal to go along with it, even including insurance, that there should be no consequence to loss. But how do you know you've lost if you're insured against consequence, you see? And then what does loss mean to you but a kind of strange and grief-encrusted payday? So how am I befriending my death? I can tell you one story.
Yeah.
Years ago, listen to me now. Years ago, he said the old guy, not so many years ago, but it feels like quite a while ago now, I was having an enormously difficult time breathing. And any yoga people in there, that you can hear it in the way I speak, that I still have that problem and certainly always will, and probably will die from it. But it was particularly bad. And in my corner of the world, the cold is like a dagger in the wintertime. And if you're pulmonarily challenged as I am, you can't make it in the winter. And I lived through about 3 of these, and it was getting worse every year. And it was very clear that there was no medicine, steroidal or otherwise, that was going to yank me back from the edge that I was eyeballing by that time. I, who'd been working in the death trade and so on, by this time, I think I was out of it. And of course, the cruelty of the irony of me being this informed by dying, but not informed enough to have any choice in the matter, certainly wasn't lost on me. And so my wife and I got in an airplane in the days when you could fly. And we went to a warm place, ostensibly for me to die in a warm place. It wasn't a very kind consideration for the people we're going to end up with, I'll grant you that, nor for the place for that matter. But I wasn't thinking about everybody. And the first morning I was there, I sat on the roof of this little house in this small town, and I looked as the dust was rising, as people were making their way towards their lives there. And I thought this question to myself: if I'm to die fairly soon, there was just enough notoriety that had gathered around me by that time to prompt me to consider the real possibility that there'd be a bit of a flurry around the advent of my death, and perhaps prompting questions not unlike this one, and that my wife would be obliged to entertain this stuff or come up with something or refuse to come up with something or whatever it was. Now, this could be self-aggrandizement that's in the story. I don't know that that's going to occur, but let's imagine in the days of hypervigilance on every friggin' event that maybe so. And so I asked myself that morning, apropos of the question you've just asked me, what does a husband do at a time like this? I was an irreversible pulmonary refugee. It wasn't going to get better. And I knew a few things about dying by this time. So I sat down and I took out a pen and I took out a writing book and I started to write every story I could remember from my times in the death trade that seemed to mean anything or seemed to matter. And as I wrote them down, and this is all handwritten, the connective tissue between the stories began to appear. And 3.5 weeks later, I think it was or so, I had written Die Wise. That's one way. In other words, it's not for posterity. It's for the sake of someone I claim to be, deeply caring about, that maybe there's a consequence to the way I die and what I try to put in place before that signals that kind of care, even retroactively. And as you can see, my self-diagnosis was madly off, and I'm still here, but no less close to my death than I was sitting on that roof. And the COVID presence hasn't accelerated it by a moment or brought it closer to me by an inch. My death is as likely now as it's ever been, as assured now as it's ever been, as ordinary as it's ever been. And I prefer dying of the ordinary kind, to be honest. It gives your ordinary life an opportunity to be conducted in its presence instead of being annihilated by it.
Thank you. Wow, I have massive goose pimples. I just thinking as you were talking, if all of us sit down, I will sit down one day and write about all the things that felt they had meaning. Maybe that's somewhere something emerges. Thank you so much, Stephen. We do have questions coming up in the chat, so I'll ask a couple of those, and then we'll open it to live questions. So Chris Wolfe was asking about your advice for people working with young people and teenagers at this time. How would you respond to him?
Wow, it's a kind of crazily open-ended question, you know. Well, the first thing is I don't give advice. I don't really believe in it. I think it doesn't serve anybody involved in the advice arrangement very well. You could, you know, stories are beautiful in that they have no moral. You know, there's something that happened, right? They're not teaching vehicles. They're the end of teaching vehicles. And the more ordinary the story, the more spectacular the consequence can be in the ordinary life of people listening. But, you know, it seems to me today where older people are so deeply compromised in the eyes of younger people, and maybe in their own eyes as well, that the world we're about to hand over to them, or in the process of doing so now, is so maligned and so hurt by our excesses that it may not be easy to look younger people in the eye. And that dis-ease that older people seem to have is compounded, it seems to me, when we go out on a limb and assume that younger people, by virtue of not being as compromised as older people are in some mysterious way spiritual geniuses, besmirched and the rest. And I mean, no, let younger people be confused, arbitrary, self-absorbed younger people. Okay, that's part of the job description, as, excuse the indelicacy of the image, but you could say the job description of a young person is to insert their head up their rectum and to admire the view for several years. You see, to become, in a sense, very familiar with that architecture, and then hopefully never have to do that again. So, but with all of that, I don't know is a very useful phrase to use in a troubled time. False reassurance, false bravado, false certainty is something culpable. And when people are asking you as something as if their life depended on, and they're 1/3 your age, and you're not sure, but you don't let on that you're not sure, there's something beyond tragic there. There's something bordering on malpractice that's unbecoming of older people. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm scared about things. Has the mysterious consequence of reassuring young people that they're not the only ones who know that the sky is falling. And I'm very persuaded that people who have observed bits of the sky falling want more than anything else to be assured that that's what they saw. And that's what the testimony of people in the trenches for a long time could possibly be, that kind of affirmation. Not the kind that would seem to be encouraging, but the sign that's the kind that seems warranted in a troubled time.
Thank you. We're getting loads of questions here, so we're not going to be asked them all. But Charlie, you are asked one about digital technology. I wondered if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask that to Stephen live. Can we arrange that? Charlie, are you able to unmute? Okay, I'm going to read this out. So it's a long question, so which is why I would have liked to get him to ask it.
I'm now unmuted. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thank you, Charlie. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the chance to ask it. This is actually a toned down version, but Stephen, I mean, generally we're aware that digital technology has amazing benefits, but also has We're more and more aware of its effects on relationship psychology, our nervous system, the cost to the environment, and sort of the hidden cost behind that we're not aware of. And yet it epitomizes our sort of unquestioned belief in our power and control and, you know, progress and marching towards the stars. And this situation where it has proliferated and, you know, here we are talking to a hitherto unseen extent. You call the internet the beast in one of your writings, and I'd like to ask if you can elaborate on it in the sense of, you know, what is the cost of this kind of quote unquote connectedness? And what do we lose in the gaze of the screen? And what is the currency that we pay for these sort of shiny wonders when algorithms and external images determine the content of our consciousness, especially now when maybe we really should be having a look inside? Thank you.
Okay, well, that's actually 3 questions and they're doozies. And the irony shouldn't be lost on any of us that we're employing the very beast that you're asking me about to wonder about the beast. And in the thing I wrote, that's one of the things I wondered, whether or not the beast can be outbeasted, if you will. And that's my advocacy, to be honest. I'm not sure that there's as much lucidity about the consequences of this stuff, this technology, as you attribute to the general public. You may know better than I am. I said already, I'm not the guy. You know, I'm a bit of a caveman in these matters, but we're not in touch. I think if we're really careful with the language that characterizes these kinds of things, and we reserve the idea of communicating for something where the intermediary, if you will, is time, is the soft edges of culture. That's the intermediary through which we find each other, not this stuff, not this stuff. This is, if I can put it this way, this is too easy. I've never seen, I shouldn't say that, I've mostly never seen the ease of the typing and the internet and the email bring out real eloquence in what I receive. And when I sit down to do it, I do everything I can to slow myself down, because the ease of the thing seems to make us prone to haste instead of to consideration. I mean, there's an irony in itself, that when something becomes easy, there's more room around it to wonder about it, because the necessity has been eased. But alas, easiness, well, I mean, if you know anything about the history of photography, one of the most amazing things that happened within 15 minutes of its development is that it went right to pornography. Not entirely, of course, but certainly. And the internet seems no different. There's a different kind of pornography. I'm not talking about the obvious one here now, but the notion that we're, quote, more in touch than ever before is a kind of, James, what's that word when you, promiscuous? It's promiscuous, that's the word, meaning that the obligation to be discerning abandoned you more or less entirely in favor of having a big consequence. And, you know, beyond that, I'm not sure I would go any further, because it's not something I think about a lot. It's something I keep away from. And of course I would recommend that, but look at where I'm doing it. Look at where I'm recommending. As John Prine, God bless him, wrote in one of his songs, blow up your TV, he said, throw away your papers. Not in order to be stupid, but to give yourself a moment's rest from this pseudo obligation to be informed. This isn't information that we're overwhelmed with. This is reactivity that we're overwhelmed with.
Thanks, Stephen. We've literally got 6 minutes left. Can we take one from, I'm not sure what your name is, Giraffe Social Enterprises? Do you want to unmute yourself, or Nusha, can you unmute? Hello, are you there? You might need to tell us your name.
Great. Greetings, Stephen. Greetings from Wales. This is Jason in Guyana. And greetings to James, who must be hiding off camera, making all the magic. The question I have is, Stephen, would you be willing to speak to something of the despair that I hear from many around, that the all clear whistle is soon to be sounded?
Sure. It's a lie. It won't be all clear. It's not supposed to be clear. You know, this idea, one of the throwaway lines that I'm hearing fairly routinely now is stay safe or be safe. And I want to say, starting when? What, by what understanding of safe am I supposed to establish this or continue it or claim it or achieve it? No. You know, that's like staying dry in a rainstorm. You're watching it from a great distance. This is a palpably unsafe time, and it's got nothing to do with this virus. So here's what I'd advocate. Some of you have heard this one before. The Irish gave us, among other things, Samuel Beckett. And Samuel Beckett is the crafter of things impenetrable. I think some of you would agree. But on occasion, the penetration, the forbiddance of penetration lifts slightly, and something brilliant leaks out. He wrote a book called I Can't Go On, I'll Go On. I love the title. I never got through the book, but let me advocate on behalf of the title now and say this. Surely there is such a thing in the lives of engaged human beings as I can't go on. Surely it's not a failure to imagine other possibilities. Surely it's the consequence of having imagined every one. The willingness to say I can't go on may be something approaching fidelity to your times. And while it's not the only thing, when it's there, it's true. And it's not supposed to not be true. And it's not a failure of the will to not be able to go on. And the rest of the title is I'll Go On. What he doesn't say is still I'll go on, yet I'll go on, I can go on. He doesn't argue with the first proposition when he supplies you with the second one. He simply says, there are times in life, friends, when you will go on not being able to. I mention that to you now to say the allegation of safety, the all clear thing, all of that, the lie of it is not that the virus will still be present in some fashion or other and is likely to recur and all the rest. The lie of that is that the compromise to our safety did not come from the virus. Okay, we're fetishizing the virus at the cost of what deeply compromises our capacity to breathe and to eat safely and all the rest. Finally, then, I would say to you that in a time of trouble such as the one we're in, not the virus trouble, the big one, in a time like this, it seems to me it's the obligation of citizens of a real democracy to occupy the position of being willing to proceed without an assurance that any of their actions, remedial or otherwise, will have any demonstrable, immediate, or any consequence at all of the kind they intend. Wanting to be reassured that your redemptive work will redeem something before you do the work is something akin to wanting to be paid before you do the job. And the time that we're in strikes me as the kind of time that asks us to proceed with a kind of courage it's crazy, it's indefensible. The courage I'm talking about is the one to imagine that some kind of day will follow us. And we have an obligation, it seems to me, fundamental, moral, primordial kind, to proceed as if the people who in some fashion or other survive all of this will want to believe and know themselves to have come from people worth coming from. That might be the only thing unfouled that we have available for them, depending on how we live from here on out until, quote, the big one, which I suspect is out there somewhere. So would that it comes, the day comes when we recognize that we're someone else's ancestors, even now. And they would proceed as if they'll need us more than we would ever imagine needing them.
Wow.
Is that 6 minutes?
That is 7 minutes actually, so we're 1 minute over. I have so many questions coming in on the chat now, and I'm sure we've all got loads, but each one of them will start off a whole different conversation. Stephen, it's been so wonderful for you to join us, and I just, yeah, really beautiful, really wise, all the things we said at the beginning. It's been a real pleasure, and we will look forward to seeing you next May, hopefully. We'll still be in the middle of the big one then, I should doubt. I mean, I should imagine, but yeah, lovely to see you. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, James, who's off your screen, for setting this up. Thank you, Cindy and Nusha from our side for being our technical hosts. Thank you to everyone that came tonight, and hopefully we will see you again soon. We're talking to Matt McCartney this time next week. Thank you, Stephen, once again. Lovely to see you. Have a lovely day.
Thank you for your time.